Yes, I would. Digital preservation as a theme has really emerged. I think archivists are familiar with the term. I think archives have been very quick into this particular topic. And of course, I mean, let's be clear from the outset what I'm talking about. Maybe it will do as a favour to kind of repeat, as it were, the truths
Sure.
of why we're here.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of podcasts looking at archives, record management, digital preservation in the time of COVID-19. I'm John Pelan. I'm the director of the Scottish Council on Archives, and I'm delighted today to welcome the executive director of the Digital Preservation Coalition, William Kilbride.
Hello, John.
Hello, William. William, digital preservation, it's probably not a term that most people are familiar with. Would you agree with that?
Sure. So digital preservation is all of the actions necessary to ensure access to digital content, as much digital content as you need for as long as you need it. So it relates directly to things which have been digitized. So there's been big programs and archives over the years to digitize analog content and make it available online, and I'm sure return to that topic in the context of COVID-19. But also it relates to materials which are, to use the jargon, born digital. So materials which, emails or websites which were created and only ever existed in digital form. So both of those types of content create a kind of need or create peculiar problems, peculiar challenges to ensure long-term access. And archivists are among the first professions, first sectors to really come across this issue. So, digital materials depend upon the kind of use of a variety of tools and technologies in order to be rendered meaningful. So you can't just put it on a shelf and expect to come back after 10 years and expect those digital materials still to work. There will be issues to do with, for example, the magnetic media, and there may be issues to do with, the magnetic media degrades. There might be issues to do with finding even a device upon which to read the magnetic media. Sit here today, John, with my laptop in front of me, not a CD drive to be seen,
Mm-hmm.
And also there are issues to do with the formats that we use. How many versions of Microsoft Word have there been in the last 10 years? And then there might be issues to do with documentation, like can we actually make sense? We've render the file, but what does it mean? So all of those issues arise in the context of the routine preservation or use of digital materials over an extended lifetime. And that extended lifetime doesn't have to actually be terribly long. In terms of lifetimes or life cycles, we're really referring to the technological life cycles, which seem increasingly quick these days. Digital materials, they age with like doggy years, they go a lot faster.
Yeah, so you mentioned that archivists maybe have been at the forefront of having to, learn pretty quickly about this new technology and the need to preserve digital assets. And you've talked about, how, organizations, businesses will rely on people to take cognizance of the importance of the assets which they hold, which are on digital form. But most of us now live in a digital world. We take digital photographs, we communicate digitally. I mean, it could be argued that the digital preservation is actually a practice that impacts almost everyone in almost every aspect of life.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if we start simply by asking what's in scope for this problem that I've outlined, this digital preservation problem, well, what's in scope is everything. Everything from a selfie stick to a space probe. Everything from the most ephemeral, routine, mundane activity to something that's cost hundreds of billions of pounds to generate and hundreds of billions of working hours to produce. All of that is to some extent in scope from the issues to do with technical obsolescence or organizational change that digital preservation has to address. So everything's in scope, and as again previously said, that might have been the case in the analog world too, where we could, however, have relied on the archivist at the end of a document life cycle to really begin the process of preservation arising then. What we find in the digital domain is the conditions in which an object, a digital object, is created, the context in which it's executed, the dependencies that exist within it. All of those questions arise at the point of creation. All of those conditions in which a digital object can survive are kind of hard baked at the point in which a thing is created, and that means preservation is no longer an issue just for the archive or for something at the end of a document life cycle. Preservation becomes an issue at the outset. And of course, I'm not going to argue here. I never had the view that we need to keep everything, and I'm certainly not thinking we need to keep everything for all time, because we would be quickly overrun. But if there are materials which we think to be of value, well, we need to take those steps a lot earlier than perhaps we've done in the past.
Well, that maybe begs the question: why bother keeping it? And on your website, you make the statement that the Digital Preservation Coalition exists to secure our digital legacy. I mean, what do you mean by digital legacy, and who is it for?
Who's it for? That's exactly the right question, John. So a lot of the discussion that kind of approaches to digital preservation start with technology, and it's very easy to be drawn into a technical discussion because there are significant technical issues here. But if all we're concerned about here are the bits and the bytes, then we're going to miss something quite important. So we need to walk back a moment and think, what is it that's at play here? We've identified digital materials as having value. They have value because of the real world impacts that they have, the things that we could do now that we couldn't have historically done. Now, we know, because of the nature of the technology that we work with, we know that there are constantly emerging barriers to access, and they arise in the context of technology or organizational change or media degradation. There are constantly emerging barriers to that use and reuse of materials. So those constantly emerging barriers to reuse and access lead us to address digital preservation as a set of practices to support the technology. But in supporting access to those materials, we're not just doing it for the sake of the bits and the bytes. Digital preservation is actually about creating and maintaining the opportunity and the value that we saw in digital materials from the outset. So in a sense, what we need to do is to come good on the promise of the access and reuse of digital materials. So when we talk about digital preservation, this is where I kind of use these kind of slightly lofty terms about a digital legacy. We're not just in this for the bits and bytes. We're in this for the people and for the opportunity that those digital materials create. And that's really at the core, the mission of the DPC, ensuring that we can hand on a future, a secure and useful digital legacy for which they'll be grateful and able to use as effectively as we're able to use it just now.
Well, thanks, William. That's really interesting. And if you don't mind now, I'd like just to turn to COVID-19.
Sure.
It's, we live in interesting times, and record keeping and digital preservation is something that I think is coming to the fore. At the beginning of the month, the digital preservation, along with a number of other international organizations, including the International Council on Archives and the Research Data Alliance, issued what I think is a very important statement. I'm just going to quote from that statement. It said, "We, the signatories, call on governments, businesses, and research institutions around the world to document their decisions and transactions now and for the future." And it goes on to say, "It is necessary for archives to be recognized and resourced as the custodians of the raw data that underpins composite data or reported information. The duty to document this information does not cease in a crisis. It becomes more essential than ever." Why do you think that the duty to document is more essential now than ever? And what does this tell us about the role of the record keeper in society?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would hazard sort of three answers to that question, and that's why we were very pleased and very happy to be co-signatories to this important declaration. So, I mean, the first thing to observe, we live in a context where decisions are being made very rapidly by agencies and authorities and by companies, by public health authorities, by researchers, which are having a profound effect on billions of people's lives. And we're having to make very rapid decision making. And increasingly, of course, what's happened is there's been a very sudden rush to technology, to the social media platforms, to the video conferencing platforms that we're using today, John, to podcasts, to all of the digital techniques which allow people to remain not to be physically distant, but not socially isolated. You know, in that sense of being able to participate in a community, albeit from home, albeit without kind of staying home and staying safe and all the other kind of key government messages. So we have quickly migrated into digital. And of course, in the process, we have perhaps left behind some of that key infrastructure, which are important for transparency, which are important for evidential legacy. You know, so there's a part of the answer to that is to say, right, key and critical decisions which will have a profound effect on billions of people, whether in their kind of work environment, whether in kind of financial economic terms, whether to do with their health, whether to do with their well-being in a variety of ways, as well as to do with scrutiny and objectivity and transparency of government. A lot of that is happening very quickly, and that has to be documented. It has to be accountable, it has to be transparent, it has to be reproducible in a variety of different environments for people to have confidence in those decisions that are being made. So that there's a kind of core component of that, which has always been the purpose of the record keeper. But when you see such profound and important decisions being made, you just want to know that there's some transparency and some accountability for that. And consequently, the more important the decision, the more important the record keeper associated with that. So that's kind of one immediate kind of layer of an answer to that.
Well, yeah, and I think that the duty to document, we would say, is kind of given truth. But what we're talking about is documenting in a crisis, which for many of us, it's not unprecedented, certainly in terms of humanity, but for many people, it's an unprecedented experience, and we're living also at a time where so much information is flowing around, so much data is swirling around, and so much of it is born digital, and so much of it
Yep.
is something that it's difficult to get hold of,
Yep.
um, or grab hold of and keep. What particular challenges, I mean, are you experiencing in terms of the current crisis in preserving, securing, and making accessible those digital assets, in securing essentially that digital legacy that we spoke about earlier?
Yeah, so for me, there's been quite a move to new technologies, and I say again, there's a mismatch between the record-keeping technologies that we're familiar with and the new technologies that have emerged to deal with the pandemic. You know, and this is where we move into a kind of brief conversation around ephemeral technologies, perhaps, John. So, we can well imagine that major decisions are happening just now on WhatsApp groups, or on Zoom calls. We can well imagine the need for rapid decision making, but the dependencies that arise from that. And that, I think, is more than anything the challenge. There's a challenge also about authenticity. So we've talked here about preservation in a very broad sense, but preservation includes ensuring the authenticity of the information. So there are significant challenges about ensuring that the information that we're receiving is authentic and up to date. And there's significant challenges, even in the best of intentions. And by the way, I'm not sure everyone has the best of intentions, but even with the best of intentions, for misinformation or information to be miscommunicated to us. So there's a very obvious divergence at this point between health advice, even just between Scotland and England. And in that sense, you get conflicting, you can't avoid getting some sort of conflicting information. So understanding the source, understanding the timeliness of that information, understanding how to respond to that information becomes very important. So having that authenticated, authentic voice matters more than ever.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned ephemeral technologies, William, and
Yep.
a lot of communication that's happening at the moment that's happening in the public sphere is perhaps recordable, but
Yep.
obviously a lot of us, don't operate in the public sphere. Where before, perhaps in a time of crisis, we might have had letters from soldiers home. We
Yep.
might have had all these physical assets that could have been recorded, but so
Yep.
much communication is not done that way. It's done privately. It's done between individuals.
Yep.
But yet, all that information contains stories and about people that will be of interest, if not of benefit, to people in the future.
Yep.
When you talk about ephemeral technologies being at risk, it says in this joint statement we referred to earlier that urgent steps need to be taken to address record keeping in ephemeral technologies. What can you maybe talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and why they are particularly at risk?
Yeah, so we use the term ephemeral technologies there, and we're covering we're covering a range of different sets of activities. But let's pull apart some themes here. So, firstly, to observe, the gap between public and private isn't entirely always clear anymore. So the personal communication and the public communication is sometimes merged, and that's inevitable, especially at a time of crisis when people might not have access to the facilities that they would have at work. Security reasons might prevent that, so people are using their own personal laptops, their own personal Twitter accounts, their own personal Zoom accounts, and so forth to facilitate practically the delivery of work and public policy objectives. So there's firstly therefore a merger or sometimes very difficult to unpick what might be considered personal, private, and professional and public roles in, for example, the difference between the First Minister's Twitter account and the Nicola Sturgeon's Twitter account, the difference between a government advisor's blog and an official statement about public health from a public authority in England. So the public and private sphere are very hard to pull apart sometimes in the digital world. Secondly, and here's a key observation to make, we talk about, you talk about number 10 Downing Street's Twitter account. You talk about Donald Trump's Twitter account. We talk about, these sources of information that exist as if they're ours, as if they belong to the person in question. So I am very active on Twitter. Those of you listening to this will probably know that. I have a Twitter account, but let's be clear about this. I don't have a Twitter account. Twitter has an account. They have the account. It's their account, not mine. The same is true on Instagram. The same is true on Facebook. The same is true on all of those other social media platforms that we have engaged with. And so in saying that I have a Twitter account, what I'm saying is I have a dependency on their business model. I have a dependency on the decisions that they make around how my information is presented, and indeed whether or not that information will survive. And there's been sufficient examples over the years of, for example, social media companies going into liquidation, simply no longer existing, changing the terms of business, all of that, which leads potentially to data loss or the loss of context or the loss of meaning or the loss of functionality, all of which makes it very difficult to be sure that we're going to be able to secure that. Thirdly, one final observation in relation to this ephemeral technologies question, to observe that I am no longer entirely clear that we can go on pretending that we can separate software from data. So I'm not entirely sure we can continue to disaggregate the data layer in our technologies from the application layer. That's quite an obscure comment, but let me try and make it really material for listeners. So say we've got the web content, we can do web archiving, we can capture web content very well. okay, so we can capture that. But as websites become more complicated, so they personalize, you know. So you have your own view on a website, John, and I will have mine. And the advertising industry typically will configure that website to the best of, you know, to your market share or mine, whatever that might be. And I'm not sure we really understand how, for example, therefore, search engines will do relevance ranking. So we know the content is there, we can preserve the content, but actually it turns out it's not the content that will drive us forward, it's how that content surfaces. And actually how that content surfaces will change day to day, minute by minute, depending on algorithms which are themselves dependent upon our behaviors, you know. Very, very difficult to reproduce that in any meaningful way. So if we're unsure of the gap between the boundary between data and software, if we're not sure who owns the content, if we're uncertain about what's public and what's private in this sphere, then all of those issues suddenly really come to the fore, especially at a time as we're in a time of crisis.
Well, you mentioned data there, William, and ownership, and obviously at the moment in the current crisis, data, or we hope it is being used to inform decision making at the
Yes.
highest level.
We're being led by the science, John.
We are being led by the science, indeed, not at all by, well, not by donkeys, not in certain places anyway. And there's a phrase, I'm not sure the exact provenance of it. I've heard you use it, I've heard others use it. It's probably been used too much. Data is the new oil. You know, when I think of data, when I think of oil, I think of something that's slippery and bad for the environment. and when I think of, you know, data that's swirling about at the moment, it sometimes seems to conflict. And you wonder,
Yes.
you know, who is actually controlling that data
Yes.
and why. You mentioned data being in, you know, private ownership, and
Yes.
you kind of touched on data manipulation. So, I mean, this is really your bread and butter, William. But you know, how can we trust data if it's
Yeah.
being misused, or if it's in the hands of people whose motives aren't necessarily for the wider benefit of society?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, John, and I'm not sure. I wish I had a simple answer to that. If I had a simple or even complete answer, I would be in you know, I would be in a very different sort of position than we are. But I love that you opened with the phrase "data is the new oil," and I love the sort of strange paradox around that. Uh, that I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, that phrase. We've lost the provenance of that phrase, and that seems to me a little allegory right there about some of the challenges that we face, because we're not entirely sure of the provenance of the issues that we have. So, how accurate is that phrase, data as the new oil? I mean, what arises from that? Well, you know, we're told that data is inexhaustible, that it's free to produce, that it's kind of limitless, that it's kind of extensively reusable, and it's an attractive proposition, but I don't really buy it. You know, every time I hear that phrase, for me, a digital preservation klaxon goes off. You know, and we've already mentioned some of the issues that arise in the context of digital preservation. You know, media degradation, bit rot, file format obsolescence, loss of context, also malware, also inadvertent deletion. You know, all of those things exist as a kind of fundamental set of challenges for digital preservation. But actually, what the experience of the coalition has been, that all of those issues are true. And here we've been geeking out about file formats for kind of 10 or 20 years. And a layer on top of that also is in train. So people with something to hide turn out to be a threat to the digital estate. You know, people who actively want to delete or actively want to alter the past, they're pretty active in their attempts to do so. And the papers today are full of an example of exactly that. So there's a risk around people wanting to delete or to change the record. Also, corporate abandonment. So, you know, again, we've heard mentioned earlier, but you know, the likes of I'm thinking this occasion, I think it was Flickr recently, who changed the settings in relation to their free accounts, to alter the number of free the amount of space available for free accounts on Flickr. And of course, the people who are well resourced will be able to respond to that. The people who are not well resourced will be the ones that suffer from that. So data is the new oil. I'm not sure that it has the same characteristics as oil. It's certainly not inexhaustible. It's certainly not always reusable, but it is certainly controlled by the wealthy and the powerful. And that seems to me to be where the analogy of data as the new oil probably does actually work, because the people who have access to the mining tools, people who have access to the refining tools, people who have access to the distribution networks turn out to be, as with oil, the people with the power.
But of course, we're told that oil is running out, but it seems to me that data
yes.
is moving in the opposite direction.
Yes.
There's been talk for quite some time about peak oil, but I don't think we're ever going to reach peak data, are we? I mean, unless the world returns to the Stone Age or an analog society, data will increasingly build up to the point where it might not be manageable anymore.
Yeah, well, you say that, but I actually think that's a nice conception, peak data. I wonder whether that is actually something which could be within reach, and within reach quite soon. I mean, so let's be clear about this. There are massive increases in the volumes of data. Okay, and this is going back a little bit now, but there's research in 2012, data increasing at the rate of about 40% per year. Okay, so our ability to generate data is expanding kind of exponentially. It's expanding at a rate of knots every year. But the ability to store data, okay, that's to say looking at the research that's happening to get more and more data into devices, does reach an absolute limit. And so we see increases in hard disk volumes of around 25% per year. And right there's a sustainability crisis, okay? Because you can't have one growing at 40% and the other only growing at 25%. It becomes like that paradox of aircraft. You know how they say that all the aircraft in the world can't all land at once because there's just not enough airport space. So that's one set of issues there. And a layer beyond that tells me, and maybe archivists who are on the listening in might want to comment, but I'm not aware of anyone reporting to me archival or library budgets increasing at 40% a year. I'm not aware of anyone
Absolutely not.
being able to afford those kind of levels of exponential growth. So, maybe there is peak data. Maybe we're close to it just now. And this is actually, I think, where digital preservation has a vitally important role, because I'm talking about preserving stuff, and people could misunderstand that I'm talking about preserving everything forever, and I'm not. What I'm doing is talking about what we need to select. What is the really, really important things that we need? What are the things which are of value? What are the things that create opportunity? Once we've identified those, we need to preserve those. We need to preserve the living daylights out of those. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but you know what I mean? We really need to throw effort into that. And that leaves us free for disposal. That leaves us free. That empowers us to make decisions about the things we no longer need. All the exponential replication of data that is actually just junk, or we just don't need 10,000 copies of the same file. So the infrastructure about digital preservation also, by the way, lends itself to being clear what it is we need to keep. And of course, if we're not making those decisions, coming back to that kind of economic analysis about the growth in data and the growth of storage, if we're not making those decisions, then the blunt trauma of economics is going to intervene for us, and things will be lost, because we can't afford to continue on that basis.
And I wonder, is there also a point where the law of physics kick in? When people talk about uploading data to the cloud, they think the cloud is some fluffy thing in the sky that doesn't have any limits. But actually, all you're really doing is uploading something to a hard disk or a server in another country.
Yes.
And there's only so many, so much memory you can squeeze into a chip, and
Yes.
at some point, are we going to reach a point, as archivists do with physical storage,
Yep.
where decisions have to be made about what to dispose of and
Yep.
what to keep?
Yeah, I think there is. So, I mean, there absolutely is a law of physics here to do with transistors and to do with things passing through gates. You can only have something, as I understand it, you could only have something the size effectively of one particle, one electron. And as soon as you have a transistor that's smaller than the size of the electron, then you're really beginning to struggle at an engineering level. So and we're approaching that. The kind of the chips that are being manufactured. I spent some time a year or so ago with Intel at their development plant in Leixlip in Dublin. And they're making transistors, they're making chips with really, really large volumes of transistors on tiny silicon wafers. But there comes a point where you simply can't reduce. The laws of physics do kick in, as you rightly observe. That's at a small scale, but listen, at a global scale, you make a point about the cloud. Let's not forget, add a layer to this and say, what's the environmental impact of all those data centers? Actually, this is really energy inefficient. It's really demanding. They talk about the mobile phone having a carbon footprint equivalent to a large fridge freezer every year. Not because of the phone itself, but because of the connectivity and all the services and so forth that it uses. So if you think of your mobile phone as having effectively the same carbon footprint as a large fridge freezer, then you think, well, hang on a minute, the complete, the overpopulation of mobile devices isn't going to be sustainable in an environmental sense for forever.
Okay, well, if I could maybe take you back a bit, William, to something you'd mentioned earlier.
Sure.
You talked about a story that was in the press just now. And I
Yep.
think we all know what you were talking about. But for
Yep.
those of us who are listening in the future,
Yep.
what we're talking about is Dominic Cummings explaining his decision to leave his home,
Yes.
which is in contradiction of the guidance and possibly the law. And it seems that explanation is very typical of
Yes.
what's happening now. We talk about this post-truth world, alternative facts,
Yeah.
fake news.
Yeah.
People are being gaslighted. People are not trusting media sources, and
Yeah.
emotion seems to be more influential than objective facts or evidence. But of course,
Yes.
as archivists, as record keepers, as people who are involved in the business of preserving digital assets, there's still a duty to record, duty to
Yes.
document. And I'm just wondering what, given that context of distrust of information, what impact does that have on the practice of digital preservation in terms of evaluating what is and what should be preserved so that it can be understood by generations to come?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot in here. I mean, I think actually digital preservation. I think archives have a really vital role here, and there's an extraordinary footnote to the Dominic Cummings story as well, which is worth explaining. If I may go into it for a moment, and then actually drawing back and talking a little bit about how digital preservation is public infrastructure for the public good. So we've heard the story of Mr. Cummings' travels from London to Durham and the trip to Barnard Castle and all of this seemingly against the regulation and potentially the law, as you've described, John. It would appear that at some point during that expedition, he decided to open his blog to write in his blog, and instead of writing new material in his blog, to edit some previous blog materials which he had written, and effectively inserting comments around the possibility of a pandemic, but inserting those comments into blog posts from significantly before the pandemic, and therefore creating the impression of an insightful and wise guru who has anticipated, who is a prophet of the pandemic. When in fact, what's become apparent from the analysis carried out at the internet, or analysis through the Internet Archive is that, in fact, he added those comments in April. He added those comments at a point in which it was already very clear that things were going very badly in terms of public health messaging around the pandemic. One might say that if he was such a wise guru, why hadn't he understood and taken better steps early? But that's another point. The point is, it would appear, alleged, that he has falsified that blog in some way. And the evidence is straightforward, because it actually turns out to be pretty hard to falsify or to edit a WARC file, the file particularly used by the Internet Archive and how they do their web harvest. I won't go into the details of that, but that shows to me the importance of archiving and web, in this case web archiving, but other forms too, of web archiving as essentially a first line defense against any manner of falsification or fraud or interfering with the official record. And if I could take this a wee bit further, maybe this is where I should become a bit political and observe that this particular incident with the blog post and Dominic Cummings, as described, it happens that the Internet Archive in San Francisco in California had the copies. The Internet Archive had taken copies of that. I know the analysis around what has happened happens because the Internet Archive, which, let's face it, is a wonderful organization, but it's a not-for-profit a US-based institution, which just by coincidence happens to have collected those blog posts, they were able to demonstrate what had happened. Now, you might wonder, why is it a US-based not-for-profit that's leading the charge here? Because there's superlative web archiving happening, whether at the National Records of Scotland, the National Library of Scotland, the British Library. There are lots of really gifted, capable web archivists working to preserve the web footprint of institutions in the UK, whether in government or in the public domain. Now, what happens in reality is that the legislation permits that harvesting, but doesn't permit the access. And so we find ourselves strangely having to lean on an institution in California to hold officials to account in the UK, when actually one would have thought that our own institutions would be well capable of doing that too, if only the access restrictions around access to web harvested material were a bit more thoughtfully and more transparently described. So maybe a little political statement there, but that, for me, that really undermines how holding public officials to account includes being able to produce evidence of the record at a particular point in time, and how it may or may not have been deleted, manipulated, transformed, changed to imply something that was certainly not there originally.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I think it points to the importance of source material as having the greatest degree of evidence and authenticity. I wonder, though, is that source material ultimately, if we were to live in an authoritarian regime, is itself deemed perhaps to be a risk and therefore is in danger of being destroyed? I mean, Mr. Cummings was unable to alter the past as much as he thought that he could because, as you say, the Internet Archive had recorded the original blog posts. But it seems to me that it's how important it is to basic human rights and social justice and our freedom and the importance of holding governments to account, as you say, that source material is there and it's retained.
Yeah. I mean, one can only imagine what that must be like in the context, as you kind of suggest, in an authoritarian regime where there would be no hesitation whatsoever in falsifying the record. And one of the things I find most amazing, though, if I may, I think about the kind of the liberation of Eastern Europe in kind of the 1980s and 90s, at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, or the archives being opened up. There's the archives, whether in East Germany, Romania, so forth, all revealing the not just what the government knew, but the sources of information to the government from all those different, from those countries at that time. And one wonders what governments are, what authorities, what agencies are hoarding information around the public, and how they choose to use it, and I'm not looking to be a conspiracy theorist here, but I do think there's a challenge about accountability and transparency, which we need to continue to think through. And if we're not alert to that, then there's a real risk that we will become a victim of that.
Okay, so we've talked about accountability and evidence. We've talked about legacy. We've talked about impact. But from a personal perspective, for the everyday person, who, as we said earlier, does spend a lot of their time operating in a digital world, whether it's taking digital photographs on their phone or communicating on social media or via email. But the term digital preservation doesn't really mean much to them. They're not really thinking, if I'm speaking to someone on social media, I should really be recording this for future generations. Any more than two people that are having an ordinary conversation would be thinking, we really should put the tape recorder on. Somebody might want to listen to this in the future. Yeah. So, but how can the practice of digital preservation be explained and made relevant so that more people can understand its importance? Because it seems to me that it's something that is so incredibly important at the moment, where we're in danger of generations to come might not have the same access to the source material as we have enjoyed, because of the fact a lot of it is transient and a lot of it is fast moving, and it's just simply not being recorded.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. I mean, so you're right to draw us back a little bit. I mean, up till now, we've been doing some very heavy lifting around accountability and public authorities. And actually, this is a story for everyone, and it's a story for everyone in a very material sense, because it's about the record of our families and our lives and the witness to our experiences, our creativity, our joys and sorrows. And, we've just come out of a period of commemorations. We've come through that period of kind of the 1914, 1919, the commemorations around the First World War, the end of the war, the truce, the armistice, Versailles, all of that centenary celebrations have just been completed, and we say they are the great treasure trove of letters home, of messages, occasionally a photograph, and to think of the value and the unusualness of even 100 years ago, photography, being able to take a photo in the trenches, being able to see a photo of a grandparent, a great-grandparent, a great-great-grandparent in military uniform, or a letter from home, would be are so precious and so valuable. And it's a paradox. We have such great freedom to create those materials, which didn't exist 100 years ago. We take photos all the time. Staged photographs of the kind of 1900s were really valuable and tremendously expensive. We have the freedom to do that all the time, and yet, because it's so free, so easy to do, they're not necessarily treated with the same kind of respect, perhaps, is that the right word, with the same value that they would have been done, as would have been the case when silver nitrate was more expensive, when production processes were for the elite, and consequently, a little reflection on that is a nice place to go. The photos I take today, the photos that appear on my phone, the messages that I'll get from my brother in Spain, my 6-year-old's birthday party, which was just about a week ago. Her 6th birthday was done in the context of the lockdown, so there's a story there, and that's a story that she will want to tell. for future generations. So we should cherish those moments. You know, these might not be the best of times. These might be complicated and difficult times for a lot of people, but these are the times that we have. These are not the best of times, but they are what we have and what we will be able to pass on. So we should value those. And if we value the times that we have, then that means we will more likely want to pass that on to the future too.
Well, I think that's a really positive note to end the discussion, William. You talked about digital preservation being a story for everyone, but also I think it's the stories of everyone.
Yes.
So, William, I'm recording this now for future generations on Zoom.
Yes.
It's going to be uploaded to the clouds, and I will then publish this on a podcast on the internet. So the whole experience has been digital, and I promise not to alter the podcast in any way. It will be the source.
Very much.
it will be the source material.
Thank you very much, John. My very own words spoken here now today, available and unaltered for all time. A small challenge for you there, John.
Absolutely. No, not a challenge at all, William. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure, John. Thank you.